Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this double inaugural lecture between two of our new professors, Professor Pip Laurenson, appointed as Extraordinary Professor of Art Collection and Care in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and Professor Dr. Rachel Pownall, appointed as Professor of Arts and Finance in the School of Business and Economics. And I will therefore now, as this is crossing faculty borders, I will first ask the deans of each of the faculty to introduce the speakers to you.
Dear family and friends and colleagues, it's a pleasure for me to introduce to you Professor Pip Laurenson. Pip holds a special chair in Art Collection and Care and Restoration at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and she also plays a very active role in our interdisciplinary center, the Maastricht Center for Arts and Culture, Conservation and Heritage, also known as MAG. Pip today, Professor Laurenson, will hold her lecture on practice and research, unfolding the objects of contemporary art conservation. Professor Laurenson, the floor is to you.
Well, thank you and welcome, and thank you for sharing this very special day with me. On the occasion of this inaugural lecture, I'll return to a theme which has been an important thread throughout my career, namely the changing nature of contemporary artworks and how this impacts is revealed and might best be supported and championed through the practices of conservation. There are different ways in which works of art might unfold. They might unfold as we seek to know them better, within the variety of epistemic cultures we approach a work from. They might unfold over time whilst on display with time-based media or performance artworks. Or for some contemporary works, they might unfold as the objects of artistic practice through the ongoing engagement of the artist. Although there are contemporary artworks which fundamentally challenge notions of authorship, these are not the subject of my lecture today. Instead, in the examples in this paper, it is the artist who has the primary authority regarding how the work itself might unfold. This is because the artworks they produce have the character of epistemic objects, and their unfolding is as the result of a continuing activity which is uniquely driven by the artist. So I'll first present the main themes of my research career to date, and then examine how my understanding of the objects of contemporary art conservation has evolved. I will attempt to offer something of a critique of my earlier work, as whilst it may have served some art well, increasingly I've become interested in works which fall outside its frame. In exploring where my research in this area might evolve, in my capacity as special chair in Art, Collection and Care within the Maastricht Center for Arts and Culture, Conservation and Heritage, I will ask whether conservation is a knowledge-producing practice, and if so, how that practice is impacted by the nature of the artwork. So taking up this chair at Maastricht University and being embedded in MAG provides me with an exciting way of exploring these questions with a new lens. I'm grateful for this opportunity to be part of this prestigious university and to work with many of you here today, my new distinguished colleagues, and to have the chance to bring new perspectives to my research. So art changes, so do we, is the slogan which Tate Modern is launching a major new extension this June. This phrase projects a vision of the Contemporary Art Museum as a reflective and receptive institution which is able to respond to the changing needs and context of art of our time. Considering the response of conservation to changing forms of artistic practice provided the impetus for my doctoral thesis, specifically the question of how conservation practice might change in response to Tate's growing collection of time-based media installations in the 1990s. So these works challenged traditional conservation in asking us to look beyond our normal focus of material deterioration and consider a different set of vulnerabilities associated with works which only really existed once installed, with many elements of the system having been brought together each time they were displayed, and which depended on a rapidly changing technological environment. So video installations, film installations, sound installations. Nelson Goodman's 1969 distinction between autographic and allographic works was helpful to me. In brief, autographic arts are things like painting and sculpture, which may exhibit the hand of the artist and be considered finished by the artist, traditionally leaving the studio as an autograph complete object. Musical works and performances are considered allographic works. One of the defining characteristics of allographic works are that they are amenable to notation and are installed or performed each time they're experienced. So here we have David Hockney standing in for autographic arts and painting, and Martin Creed's work standing in for allographic works, his performance piece. So this distinction signalled to me a way in which we might think of new notions of authenticity, change and loss for time-based media artworks. I used my doctoral research to establish a conceptual framework in which I could practice as a conservator for these types of artwork. I remain convinced that the nature of the things we're seeking to attend to in our collections should impact how we approach our conservation practice. In short, ontology matters. So in this early work, I shifted the ontological frame of the conservation of time-based media works of art towards the allographic. A focus on the allographic led me to the philosophy of music, particularly the work of the philosopher Stephen Davies, and his rich vocabulary, both for understanding works of art in terms of their work-defining properties, and also in his notion of works being either thickly or thinly specified, depending on the degree to which the artist or the creator determines the details of their faithful renditions. These concepts prove pivotal in providing for the diversity of approaches to the fixity of the identity of an artwork expressed by artists with which I was working. And if I look back at the art which I worked on as a conservator for those opening displays of Tate Modern in 2000, it's unsurprising that I developed a theoretical frame that focused on capturing the work-defining properties of thickly specified installations. So artists such as Bill Viola, Gary Hill, Steve McQueen, Stan Douglas, and finally, James Coleman. These all required precision in the realization of their works. So an example of a thickly specified allographic work par excellence is James Coleman's Sharon MIT project from 1989. This complex installation is composed of 14 discrete segments employing a soundtrack that is synchronized to a sequence of 35mm slide images that are projected from 3 different carousel slide projectors. The voiceover recounts episodes from the life of the photographer and is juxtaposed with images that relate to the accounts given, evoking moments of transition, for example, between the staged and the real, anticipation and loss, youth and old age. The piece demands time from the viewer and from the institution. In the weeks before the opening of Tate Modern, the custom-built space for James Coleman's work had been completed to the artist's exacting specifications. The walls were painted, the carpet was laid, grey felt acoustic panels had been shipped specially from Italy. An acoustic engineer even fired a pistol to measure the reverb to help us to fine-tune the acoustics. The synchronization of the slides to the audio track had been programmed, tested, adjusted, After months of preparation, the final day of the install came. James arrived, we slowed things right down, and the fine-tuning began. So thickly specified works sit well within the practice of conservation, a practice that provides us with a belief that if we pay attention, we can understand, document, and capture those elements of the work which will enable us to define its important properties. Conservators operate out of a responsibility to cherish and honour the artwork and its history by ensuring its important features are chaperoned through time, intact, conserved for the future as evidence of our present. So the vocabulary of work-defining property also feeds the pragmatic temperaments of conservators in providing a roadmap. When we have defined what should be preserved, we can kind of get on with the task of keeping those important features of the work intact. Where these cannot be maintained because of changing technological or changing cultural, social, or political circumstances, heroic efforts are made and great human ingenuity is brought to bear on finding solutions. If this fails, the language of loss may be evoked. So fundamental in my approach to these thickly specified allographic artworks was the notion of completeness. In contrast, what about those works which defy this idea of completeness and continue to want to unfold within the museum? Here, the shift of focus to notions of practice provides a different and fruitful perspective. So let's consider for a moment the notion of conservation practice. My role at Tate is within the research department, and I find myself reflecting on the practice and practices of the museum in a different way from when I was conservator. In 2007, Tate was awarded Independent Research Organisation status by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and continues to be actively involved in an ongoing process of critically examining what it means for the museum to be a research organisation. Central to the museum are both its practices and its collection, and the value of art to society, something which Rachel will speak about later. They are therefore also at the heart of our research. The dominant concept of museum research has until recently been object-focused and largely art historical. At Tate, we are seeking to articulate and explore something of a practice turn of our own. The concept of a research practitioner is therefore of great interest, and in examining the literature, much of it focused on notions of reflective practice and methodologies which enable practitioners to conduct research that focuses on and provides new knowledge that might inform or improve their practice. There's less focus in this body of literature intended for the practitioner on how an examination of practice might provide an insight into the objects of inquiry. And in my case, the museum, its value, its activities, and the nature of its collections. So in roaming around this new terrain, I've been particularly struck by the work of Karen Noor-Cetina, who has opened up for me a different way of thinking about practice. So given Maastricht University's leading role in research related to science, technology, and society, many in this room will know her work far better than I. However, for those who are not from this field, Noor-Cetina is a sociologist who has studied the professional practices of scientists. In her paper, Objectual Practice, Noor-Cetina focuses on knowledge-centered professional practice, which she characterizes as both creative and constructive. It is the type of practice that is present when we're confronted with non-routine problems. She also characterizes this type of practice as relational rather than performative, meaning that the focus is on the relationship to a differentiated epistemic object rather than on performing a particular habitual task. Noor-Cetina therefore foregrounds our relationship to the things we are engaged with as epistemic objects during our knowledge-producing activities. Now, responding to the diversity of artistic practice and the changing nature of art, I'd like to argue that we characterise the objects of contemporary art conservation depending on the practices, culture, and questions which are being asked both by the artist and the conservator. So what does this notion of practice offer to conservation? Our understanding of certain works within our collections and the characterisation of practice as research within the museum. In the conservation of autographic artworks, the conservation object is still largely perceived as an object that can be known through scientific analysis. In contrast to North Cetina's epistemic objects, these objects of conservation are described as fixed matters of material fact. They are not open, but rather closed. They carry with them a sense of completeness that can be known. Can we characterize conservation as an epistemic or knowledge-producing practice? Consider the extraordinary collaborative treatment carried out at Tate by the conservation scientist Bronwyn Ormsby and the conservator Rachel Barker, who together treated Mark Rothko's painting Black on Maroon, removing the ink that was applied as an act of vandalism to the painting in 2012. Here, the damaged corner of Rothko's painting has become the epistemic object of their conservation practice. The core of the inquiry was, can the ink from the vandalism be removed without damaging the underlying paint layers? And establishing these facts was the core objective of the research. The expertise that is brought to bear is both that of the conservation scientist and also the painting conservator. The object of the research is what North Cetina would characterize as open, question-generating, complex. Observation and inquiry reveal them, the knowledge objects, by increasing rather than reducing their complexity. The treatment involved 18 months of painstaking work, involved the creation of samples to mimic the complex layer structure of the painting and the penetration of the ink, followed by numerous experiments in solubility and method. On a number of occasions, these experts were forced back to the drawing board to try different techniques, demonstrating how their new knowledge led them to adapt their practice. And I recommend the compelling video that's online around this treatment. In his work, looking at the characterization of practice as research, Henk Borgdorf outlines the key criteria for a process to be research as follows. It should be intended as research, and in the context of an institution working outside the academy, this means being conceived of such by the practitioners, communicated as research, and made explicit through a culture of reflective practice. Secondly, it should provide an original contribution to knowledge, and of course, in the case of the Rothko, no one knew how to remove this ink. It will have research questions to identify the focus of new knowledge, the new knowledge to be generated, and be conducted within a certain context. In this case, I'd argue the emerging epistemic culture of conservation research. It'll use certain recognised methods and be documented and disseminated. So while it's not difficult to frame the type of practice exemplified within the Rothko case as research, how, I wonder, does this characterization of conservation and the objects of conservation fit with art which are not at all like the Rothko painting, but instead are time-based media installations or performance artworks, artworks that are more allographic? What drew me to the work of Karen North Cetina and her account of epistemic objects is the degree to which it aligns with our experience of working with those artworks which fail to fit our assumption of the complete artwork for which a set of work-defining properties can be described. I would like to explore the possibility that these artworks are also themselves epistemic objects of artistic practice, as well as the epistemic objects of our conservation practice. Debates regarding the notion of art practice as research, within the UK at least, have focused largely on the role of the universities, with Christopher Frayling in his 1993 paper, Research in Art and Design, defining 3 modes of research related to the arts: research on the arts, research for the arts, and research in the arts. It is the latter which is the main focus here. So in some cases where artistic practice is pursued as research, methodologies from academic disciplines, such as ethnography, are commandeered. In other cases, artistic research develops its own methodologies. For example, Hito style cites situationist dérivé and workers' inquiries, constructivist montage, cut-ups, biomechanics, oral history, deconstructive or surrealist anthropology, the diffusion of counter-information, as well as aesthetic journalism, in her litany of artistic research methods. I'd like to suggest that the relationship of some artists to their artworks as epistemic objects helps to illuminate ways in which certain artworks in our collections fail to conform to notions of completeness. So let's spend some time with these unruly artworks. In 1984, Susan Hiller's Belshazzar's Feast, The Writing on Your Wall, was the first video installation to come into Tate's collection. The work references numerous newspaper reports of people hearing messages on their television sets after the networks had closed down. They'd sort of fallen asleep in front of the telly and heard these voices. This work has taken on a number of forms over time. When it was first shown at Tate in 1985, Hiller describes this as a provisional setup that was barely even a maquette. Her use of the term maquette suggests a rough draft, a sketch, and it implies incompleteness at odds with a traditional notion of an object which has been acquired by a major museum. Susan sold the work to Tate as a unique work, however, retained a version which she refers to as the artist's copy. And in a note to me, she wrote, "I have had great pleasure in designing several different installed versions of my artist's copy." Belshazzar's Feast was also shown in 1986 in what Susan refers to as her campfire version. On January the 29th, 1986, Channel 4, which is a British commercial broadcaster, broadcast the video element on television. And the work was also featured in the arts documentary State of the Art, where it's shown as being broadcast into a traditional, if rather kitsch, British living room of the time. It was this that Hiller told me inspired what she calls the full Tate version of the work, which was realised when the work went on display in 2002. Since then, the work has been shown with different furniture and equipment in different spaces around the world. And for her show at the Listen Gallery last year, she created a bonfire version. Here is a work which has unfolded and I suspect will continue to unfold each time the artist engages with its installation. Is this the unfolding of an epistemic object? Should we see Hiller's artistic practice as research? Susan Hiller was originally trained as an anthropologist, completing her doctorate in 1965. And it's notable that elements of her work suggest a critique of anthropological methodology. Susan Hiller has been closely involved in the production of the display each time the work is installed. However, she surprised me recently by clearly stating a lack of interest in what might be the future of this work after her death. Conservators are, of course, focused on the future lives of artworks 50 or 100 years hence, whereas for Susan, it was her ongoing engagement with the work in the present and its continued unfolding that she found compelling and relevant. Susan refers to this work as being revealed. It is easy to confuse the way in which this work might operate as an epistemic object for the conservator and for the artist. If the artworks function as epistemic objects for these different constituencies, the artist and the conservator, and no doubt many more, the curator and the art historian, then it is important to understand that the identity of these epistemic objects will be determined by who is engaging in them. the culture associated with their practice, and the nature of their questions. Other artists are only triggered to think about the continued unfolding of their works when they are presented with the prospect of a new phase in the life of their artwork, raising questions about who has the right to be the author of its future unfolding. So, for example, Cécile Floyer's work, Carousel, 1996, engages with notions of technological obsolescence. The work is comprised of a record player which plays a recording of the sound of a carousel slide projector from a vinyl record. And there's probably people in this room who've never heard a carousel slide projector, so essentially it's a sort of ka-chunk noise that repeats. As part of my conservation practice, I discussed with the artist the possibility of a future where the technology underpinning the piece might be obsolete. Discussing with the artist the possible forms the future life of this work might take, she surprised me by suggesting that she would like to work with the museum to create this future iteration. The artist saw the potential for this to be part of the unfolding of her work, which only she could author. A very different image of unfolding is evoked by Julia Scher in relation to her installation Predictive Engineering. Now, the director of the Artist Initiative, a Mellon-funded research project at SF MoMA, Robin Clark, references Julia's description of predictive engineering as an episodic, self-documenting and self-consuming work that gobbles up previous iterations of itself. Each time the work is realized for a different space, while certain formal elements of the work remain, there is a layering, ingesting and recycling that occurs. And this is a work that's been in the collection for, I think, about 40 years now. These examples are diverse. There are cases where the artwork has unfolded over time, taking on different forms, as in Susan Hiller's Belshazzar's Feast. Julia Scher evokes the idea of previous iterations of the work being ingested and recycled each time it is installed anew. There are other examples, which I've not had time to go into today, where the artist is very explicit about feeling uncomfortable with the notion of completeness for both their practice and their work. And also cases where the artist invites us to allow work to unfold according to what is important to each conservator or curator responsible who engages with it as an epistemic object, continually materially defining the work, but perhaps also allowing the formal traces of previous iterations to exist. And all of these works have found a home within our collections. In his foregrounding, the practice and experimental activities of science, the philosopher of science, Garbolino, is able to draw the following parallel between art and science. Both artists and scientists intervene in the world. An intervention is a process in which the underlying causal reality is used to do, to make, or change things. At the heart of this view of science is a notion of an experiment. An artistic experiment produces knowledge by creating phenomena that affords epistemic access to the features it exemplifies, making those features salient in a way that would not be easily available in everyday life. Of interest to our discussion today, Garbolino also identifies a common question between artists and scientists regarding where an experiment ends, echoing this open-ended, unfolding quality of many of the artworks discussed in this paper. For those artists discussed in this lecture who have, in different ways and to varying degrees, seen their works to continue to unfold, their relationship to the unfolding of a work over time is not the same as how that might be approached by the curator or conservator. Framing these works as epistemic objects of research provides a different way of understanding the ongoing engagement of the artist with their works and in our engagement with their conservation. The key focus for conservation research in these cases lies in understanding what it means to enable these works to unfold within our museums as the epistemic objects of artistic practice, and perhaps to change the culture. It is also to find a way to keep visible this specific identity during their active life after the death of the artist. So the notion of an epistemic object allows for a theoretical framework which supports difference, allowing works of art to be different types of epistemic object for diverse disciplines and people. This not only allows for the variability around the practices that are appropriate in relation to that epistemic object to be freely articulated, it also allows for distinct artworks to be able to flourish in quite dissimilar ways within the museum. So I'd like to just take a few moments of thanks. I'd like to first thank the Rector Magnificus and the Executive Board for the great honour of being an extraordinary professor in this esteemed university. I'm also grateful to Professor Rein de Waal, the previous Dean of FASOS, who initiated this special chair, and also the current Dean, Professor Sophie van Hunacker. Thank you for your warmth of your welcome. I'm extremely grateful to all those who've made this secondment possible, in particular the heroic efforts of our human resources and finance departments at both Maastricht University and Tate. I want to thank them for their support and patience during this process. I'm greatly honoured that Caroline Collier, Tate's Director of Partnerships and Programmes, and our Acting Head of Research made this journey to share this special moment with me today. And I'd like to thank her and Tate's Director, Sir Nicholas Sirota, for their encouragement for making it possible for me to embark on this adventure into the world of academia. Their support has been extraordinary. During this process, we've seen a leadership change in research at Tate, and I'd like to acknowledge Professor Nigel Llewellyn, who has done so much to champion this collaboration between Tate and the University of Maastricht. I would also like to thank my many colleagues who've helped me on this journey over the years, in particular my first employers in the Conservation Department, Derek Pullen and Jackie Human. After practicing as a conservator for 10 years, I knocked on the door of Jonathan Ashley Smith, who was then head of conservation at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and told him about this rather crazy idea I had of wanting to do a doctorate. Doctorates in conservation, especially those that were not technical art history, were fairly uncommon in those days, and it was Jonathan who first opened that door. Characteristically, he was also the first to congratulate me once the news of this special chair went public, and I hope that I'm always as kind and generous to those who hesitatingly knock on my door. I'd also like to thank my other two doctoral supervisors from the Institute of Archaeology, Suzanne Keane and Elizabeth Pye. My early research was generously supported by Pam and Dick Cramlick, two extraordinary patrons who continue to be great champions of research in this area. I'd also like to acknowledge Jill Sterrett, the Director of Collections at SF MoMA. I'm honoured to count Jill as a mentor and a friend, and someone who can always be counted on to offer a fresh and a thoughtful vision to the field. It was Professor René van der Waal and Dr. Vivian van Cez who introduced me to this wonderful faculty. Professor van der Waal has brought an exemplary quality of thought to the field of conservation. Tate is delighted to be a partner in the Marie Curie ITN New Strategies for the Conservation of Contemporary Art that she leads. These 15 doctoral students will surely define the field for the next generation. Dr. Vivian van Cez and I were both doctoral students when we first met as part of the research project Inside Installations. This initiative changed the face of contemporary art conservation, clearly signalled the leadership of the Netherlands in this area, and created a network which is still alive and well today. And it's great to see so many from that network here in the audience. I think we all owe an enormous debt to Tatja Schulz for her vision in pulling together that project, and I'd like to thank her also for being in the audience today. I'm delighted to be part of these early days of Mach's development, which under Vivian's imaginative directorship will undoubtedly make an extraordinary contribution to the field. This centre has an essential role in championing research using the tools of the humanities and social sciences in the conservation and management of our cultural heritage. And I'm extremely honoured to be part of something so exciting at its inception. I'd also like to thank my partner Kim Donoghue and our son Auden for their unerring love, support and patience in this process. And finally, I owe a great debt of gratitude to my parents, my late mother Daniela Laurenson, who gave me her deep love of objects. She would have thoroughly enjoyed being here today and is greatly missed. And my father, Ian Laurenson, who gave me his love of books and a sense that I could do whatever I found interesting as long as it made me happy. So I'm delighted that he's here today to share in this very special and happy day. Thank you.
Dear Rector Magnificus, dear Professor Laurenson, dear Deans, ladies and gentlemen. As Dean of the Maastricht University School of Business and Economics, I've got the honor and foremost pleasure to introduce to you Professor Dr. Rachel Pownall. The formal introduction starts with highlighting Rachel's affiliation. She still is affiliated to many universities, among which Tilburg, TIAS Nimbus Business School, Tilburg University, Erasmus University, Rotterdam, but she's also worked in the private sector for Mees Pearson, Fortis Bank, Derivatives Department in Amsterdam. There's lots of things she did and she learned from that I won't mention here. The list would be too long, but Rachel is an internationally recognized and reputed researcher in arts and finance, and not only in arts and finance, but her international reputation stretches as far as Shanghai, New York, and cities such as, beautiful cities such as London, Miami, Paris, where she has been engaged in organizing, co-organizing many art and many art events and conferences. Her research is illustrating, I think, the dynamism or the dynamics and the innovativeness of the department of which she's a member. She's a member here at University of Maastricht, the Department of Finance at my beautiful faculty. And this is not only a warm department with people fiercely loyal to each other, and this is illustrated by the fact that her professors here, her colleagues, are all here, and this is exemplary. I thank you very much for your presence. It is also a department that I, as a dean, if I meet its leadership, I always count my fingers after shaking hands with them, because they're extremely entrepreneurial, extremely innovative. And the fact that Rachel is not only an innovative, but also, and not only an elegant person, but also an elegant researcher is telling, because there is elegance in your research, Rachel, I can assure you. Let me keep it here and stop here and just give the floor to an exciting person for whom family, husband, kids is equally important, equally challenging as the research she continues to do here at our university and at other universities. Rachel, the floor is yours.
No, thank you very much for that warm welcome, I should say, I think. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to be here today on this occasion of this joint inaugural lecture. It's a very special day for me, and I thank you all very much for sharing this moment with me. As a child, I didn't dream of becoming a doctor or professor. However, I did dream of the stars. This cover picture here for the university's celebration of their 40th years reflects this image, to open the mind and look at the stars. I always had an inquisitive mind and enjoyed asking questions about the bigger picture, fascinated by the stars in the night sky, and how my father used his sextant to navigate across the sea in his yacht. He could trace his bearings using the pole star and showed us the stars in the clear night sky where we were lucky enough to grow up in the southwest coast of England. The sky above us was part of the northern hemisphere. My mother's perspective, on the other hand, was very different. She grew up in the southern hemisphere under a different set of stars, the stars of the Southern Cross, in the South Pacific Ocean, familiar to some on the New Zealand flag, or at least for the time being, as they may change it, a different perspective on the world, where the swill of the water goes down the plug in the reverse direction than in the northern hemisphere, where the sunny side of the house faced north, whereas I was used to facing south to be in the sunshine. Architects and town planners all have a different perspective and therefore objective when confronted with the same issue about town planning, architecture and design. I was always fascinated in how much our natural elements determine how we see things, how the tides in the English Channel are driven by the gravitational force and pull of the moon, how the neap and spring tides depend again on the position of the moon. Technology has done much to advance us, but has moved us away from our natural roots. Yachtsmen no longer need to rely on the stars as a guide when they can use their GPS systems. We no longer need to wash clothes by hand or rely on a dishwasher, or our reliance on a dishwasher means that we may no longer even notice which way the water swirls down and empties down the drain. So technology and its advance has brought huge leaps in these time-saving devices, and we can do things on our smartphones faster than perhaps in the 1960s trying to reach the moon. And this speed of technology is unprecedented and almost unfathomable for our children to understand. Yet it's only with creativity and inspiration, the understanding of what we value and how to create that new future is actually how we will continue to develop and innovate. Culture and science are hugely intertwined. So maybe now it becomes less surprising that I am a researcher in finance, but I'm here today to talk about the arts and culture. So let me just open with a question, or perhaps a reflection for you all. Think back to the last event, cultural event that you went to. Maybe it was a museum opening, or it was an exhibition, a concert. Maybe you went here to the TFAF already this week. How did you feel on leaving? Perhaps you were excited, energized, inspired. Perhaps you were just relaxed, or you enjoyed all the flowers that are there at the entrance hall on the way into the museum. Well, one thing that's been shown is that well-being is increased after greater interaction with arts and culture. You could say it's part of the health service. So it has benefits in helping us understand the world that we live in and how to learn about ourselves. If a loved one has died or hurt, then there's a hunger or a craving for something to put that suffering into context. Bring a measure of relief to our troubled selves. Art isn't just entertainment, but it has a much more profound value to society. Take, for example, this painting on display at TFAF, the Parisian art dealer. It was painted by an 18, 19-year-old, just a teenager, and already at that young age he had the ability to express the emotions and transcend them to a canvas so that we could understand and the painful situation that's been going through the patient's mind. Extremely moving also this year were the images of a young refugee, a boy washed up on the beach in Greece. That image brought more to the plight of refugees than most other news reports. Images and art are a powerful force for conveying information. Another artwork at TFAF this year, it's at the Fine Arts Society. It's actually a hologram by Chris Levin, Kate's Light, and this may inspire you. It may not, but it did inspire one particular person, a famously inspired somebody on his way to work one morning. And he was the founder of what we now more commonly refer to as the holographic principle in physics. It refers how 3D space can be described as 2D, and the inspiration for this theory came to the professor when he was just noticed this type of hologram in the morning. Here, connections are made between the holograph image and the complex problems of black holes which he was working on. Similarly, making connections between abstract concepts often occurs when confronted by a related but different view or perspective on the issue or problem at hand. These moments of inspiration occur by the ability of our minds to think outside the box, beyond the norm. As researchers, teachers, leaders, this is what inspires us, gives us a different perspective, and this has a huge value in society. Some of the reasons why we value the arts, but moreover, art can provide a catalyst for change. And this is something that Pip adhered to in her talk, referencing Garbolino. Arts represents an outlet of expression and is a physical manifestation of the internal creative impulse. It therefore can help change culture. And the culture of finance is also in need of change, and how we go about this change is the essence of also my talk today. It's also the passion that drives my research. You're probably familiar with a quote by George Bernard Shaw about progress. It's impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. Well, I also like this quote by the French painter Georges Braque, art is meant to disturb. And as scientists, we like to find reassurance in our models for our ideas. We like to generalize, we use representative agents. In economic theory and traditional classical finance, we focus on rationality. In finance, we focus less on the creative impulse. Even on the heated trading floor, we assume that traders act in a rational manner and execute trades as information changes. But as participants on financial markets, it's actually us who drive and define market values. Currently, that focus is on shareholder value. In the financial services industry, transactions for millions of dollars are traded literally at the press of a button. There's a disconnect between the effort that's gone behind the savings, paying off a mortgage, a careful investment by an individual, and those huge trades that institutional investors make. Perhaps little consideration of the value of the money to the everyday man on the street. So how do we reconcile those financial values? That value to the pensioner from what he can buy with his retirement income, the value that comes with the security of actually having paid off your mortgage, or the value of having enough savings in the bank that you can finance your children's education or provide them with opportunities. These are all motivational factors which play a hugely important role in financial decision-making, and they require a true understanding of the value chain in making decisions. When we currently consume or invest, we often ignore vital questions having to do with the manufacturing process, the physical and economic health of workers, and consumption and investment comes at the expense of our natural world, our environment, and our human resources, the people. Our focus is on the profits rather than the planet and the people. Unless we start to place more intrinsic value on these non-shareholding stakeholders, these non-financial aspects like the planet and the people, how can we expect the market to? If we're not informed about the value chain and the external cost of society, then how will we change? These are social and public costs, and undoubtedly for the current generations and for futures to come. And traditionally, we've chosen to externalise these costs as a whole, and our implicit contract, of course, with businesses that they act according to the disciplines of the free market and require businesses to, the markets allocate resources efficiently. Of course, the government should intervene and redistribute accordingly. But there are market failures, externalities, and the result of focusing on the single mechanism of profit is not necessarily an efficient allocation of resources. So how do we actually place much more focus onto intrinsic values? Well, it is a puzzle, and it's probably one of the most challenging research questions that a lot of us are trying to tackle also in our innovative department. And the aim of this address is to show that bringing culture and change and creativity to finance in the form of investment decision-making is something that will bring us further in our understanding as a society and bring the interests and wants of individual investors in line with funding and financing opportunities which have traditionally been underfunded or even excluded. And this may be because externalities or these consequences are mispriced, but turning to the arts helps us to think about these externalities, realise the challenge and bring innovation and creativity to finance. Take a moment to think about this quote from Oscar Wilde, the Irish writer. Because factors aren't currently priced doesn't mean we cannot motivate investors to value them. It requires educating investors and consumers. The arts gives us a perspective with which we can face this challenge. It gives us a different lens with which we can look through the world, through which we can disrupt and disturb. Depicted here is a recent Ai Weiwei exhibition at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, and this highlights the cost to the Chinese society from a rapid expansion and production for consumers worldwide. He's a famous contemporary artist, and he straightened out 90 tons of steel reinforcement rods from schools which collapsed due to the substandard building regulations during the 2008 earthquakes. In his other work, he awakens us to many other externalities, such as the high level of pollution in Beijing, cheap plastic goods, etc. I don't advocate to prevent nor protect our economy from the availability of these products, just that when we consume, we need to consider the external costs and benefits on society from consumption of these goods and services. This is a great example of how the arts can help society, educate society to value non-financial aspects of goods and services. But for many, intrinsic motivation is not enough to change behaviour, and we require extrinsic motivation. Reward and penalty through the price mechanism is the way which we can incentivise individuals to change behaviour. So other ways we can focus are tapping into behavioural aspects like praise and competition, prestige. Recent research in neurofinance aims at understanding the reward mechanisms in the brain with respect to risk, and our brains act and respond to many types of rewards, not just financial. So learning to value the emotional, social, creative and expressive aspects of investments is actually key in this context if we want to develop valuation models where we can encourage investors and financiers to focus on long-term sustainable investments, such as innovative enterprises, socially responsible investments, and funding the structural development of the creative economy. To do this, we also need to value the positive externalities in society. Inspiration, creativity. Think back to the feeling you had when you left the last cultural event that I asked you at the start of this presentation. If we were able to put a sincere and effective reason on why we value the arts, then it would make a true difference to our lives. Then we could actually harness the power of the arts. And access to the arts has an impact on social and cultural aspects of life. Healthier workforce reduces stress, related costs in healthcare, physical and psychological well-being improves productivity, community and social activities improve a sense of community and trust, even a reduction in the slowdown of our cognitive abilities. Artists can provide us with this inspiration and change. Did you know that Cézanne was also a neuroscientist? This is a painting of Cézanne, of his, and he painted this in the late 19th century. And he paints as indeed neuroscientists have realized that is actually how our brains see. So science can learn from the arts as well as being inspired from the arts. Further, from a neuroimage perspective, how we make decisions with visual stimuli and how we process information and learn is one of the areas which the university is currently involved with in the Centre for Neuroeconomics. Questions that we're trying to answer about how the brain responds to colours, to images, how images influence our moods, our well-being, and of course our decision-making. How this mechanism functions with respect to our understanding our decision-making will help us unleash the potential of the arts and culture on economics and society. And my current research aims to try and reconcile these differences. Understanding the additional returns in the form of additional utility, the warm glow from altruism, refreshing rationality, as I term it, adjusting financial returns for financial risks, in the terms of psychology, affective psychology literature, so that risks are lower when we enjoy something, it has an affective response. And in my research, I look at this with aspects of saving behaviour, artistic and emotional values, and social preferences. For those with a social conscious, utility is clearly derived from these non-financial, non-pecuniary aspects. So it's simply not a case of financial reward at all cost. People care about the social and cultural impacts of their investment and not just those financial returns. Utilitarian benefits of expressive and emotional benefits play a role. And these may be obtained by higher status, simply trading as entertainment, playing and winning on stock markets, and adhering to our values, perhaps just living in a fair and just world, rather than just this strict focus on financial risks and returns. If we consider non-financial returns, we can correct for the fact that the market doesn't price in the social and cultural value to the investor when choosing what to invest in. And I'm keen to further develop my research along these lines, determine exactly how preferences influence decision-making over the short and the long term, is a benefit to understanding what motivates investors to actually value these externalities. The art market is one avenue with which these values can be analysed, using empirical data over time. Take again that teenager who painted that artwork. He did leave his young signature on the back, RHF. The painting was picked up for $500 in Brooklyn only last year, and then put up for sale and it went for $800 at auction. It fetched $1 million. It's because it's been ascertained that the artwork's actually attributed to someone much more famous, a famous Dutchman, somebody who I'm sure you all know in this room, Rembrandt. It's only the size of a small A4, and it's on display at TFAF. But it's not for sale, it's been sold for 3 to 4 million by an American billionaire. And using data from repeat sales like this, I've constructed a large database and been able to consider the potential returns on art as a financial investment. Well, in this particular case, of course, it was a huge positive return in just under a year. Perhaps at the expense of the original seller in Brooklyn, an unvirtuous buyer in the eyes of Professor Scar, who talked this morning. And again, it was taken out of the public domain by a second unvirtuous buyer. Issues and fairness and justice aside for a moment, let's just think about the chances of such a high return. Well, obviously, very, very small. But actually, how unlikely? In order to show this, we can look at empirical data to give us some understanding of the returns to art. Putting together an index can help answer some of those questions. And this is what I was particularly interested in, looking at London and European markets. And it was a challenge, of course, to create 20,000 repeat sales of historic data going back to 1776 from auction sales results in London, at a time where James Christie was the auctioneer at Christie's himself, to create this index. It's now a constituent of the May Moses series of all art indices and used as one of the leading benchmarks worldwide. We can see from 1776 until the end of 2014 that the return was a 5.3% annual basis. Adjusting for inflation, that works out just above 3%. Amsterdam sales didn't do so well, or at least since post-war, as markets moved to London, Hong Kong and New York. But art price data give us an extremely interesting case for valuation. We can look at the long-run return to art and how much society prices arts over time. As you can see, it's cyclical, the value increases and decreases, and in the moments when they increase, then there's always a return to this notion of art as an investment in the 20s, the 60s and the 18s, and now again. And art market's currently flourishing again with global rising prices. We've seen how valuation is inherently subjective. It's bought for its subjective value, which gives us the possibility of thinking about these non-pecuniary benefits. And from my perspective, it's this aspect of art that makes it a particularly interesting and intriguing area for research, and we have a lot of information about the heterogeneity of behaviour and preferences, also how taste is valued by society at large. In pricing art, the artist is the most important factor. Of course, other factors like size, genre, medium are all very important as well, but not as much as the artist. But characteristics that evoke strong emotions, such as poignancy, catharsis, that they're disarming or confrontational, that may induce sentiments of sadness or fear, these are all latent values in quantitative prices and models. In an attempt to capture emotions, mood's been proxied in the finance literature using the weather. We did a similar study looking at art data in London, where we know it's notoriously high for rainfall, and found that on particularly sunny days, there's a positive impact on prices. More recently, I've been looking at quantitatively measuring the subjective value of colour. Focusing on artworks for Andy Warhol, I found a premium for darker works, and I'm interested in developing this research in understanding how individuals value subjectivity. Of course, prices in the art market do tend to go up, but they can go down. The subjective value of a Canaletto may never go to zero, but there are other reasons why it may go to zero. Changing tastes and prices reflect this. One would expect artworks with a richer art history to show less variability in price, so that idiosyncratic risk is less. Those with less of a track record will show much more price variability, uncertainty around the future value. So by its very definition, contemporary art will be much more risky. Prices may go down if genres go out of flavour and exhibit high downside risk. This would also occur in the event that the artwork's proven to be a fake or a forgery, and thus reputation and provenance is key. Provenance is indirectly captured by the genre and the year and these painting characteristics of these models. And these art markets provide us, therefore, with interesting case to see how volatility is captured and the uncertainty surrounding market participants' forecasts. You could think of valuation of contemporary art like venture capital for startups. There is uncertainty in the art historians of the next generation will value contemporary art, whereas the blue chips of the day are like the old masters. Here we see the risk-return relationship using the old master paintings from my database, and you see this positive relationship generally for risk and return. And the uncertainty that a particular artist goes out of fashion exists from cultural heritage value is less likely, of course, to be the case for more reputable and established artists. There is more fundamental value. The rate of return is lower, perhaps, and the overall uncertainty is, of course, less. So it's an interesting avenue looking at these individual return distributions for artists. In the wake of the global financial crisis and low levels of trust in financial markets, we typically create high subjective uncertainty, a precursor in explaining higher returns to investment, and here psychology is inherent in all markets. Yet we observe this directly in the art market, and we can use this across to look at stock markets and art markets together. And related to this, the developments in the art finance field to measure and interpret risk, institutions and organisations are currently providing products and services to reduce that risk, derivatives on art markets, lending platforms to lend against art, peer-to-peer lending, bringing crowdfunding to the market, releasing actually the value from art. Here I've rebased back to the post-war period, and we see an enormous period of growth. But generally in times of austerity, government funding is reduced and initiatives towards private sector funding are encouraged. Typically for art institutions, they're hit most hard in times when they're in need of most subsidies. And this is when the general public spends less time visiting art institutions. But probably they would benefit more from those art in times of austerity. The marginal utility from visiting a cultural event could be argued to be greater during periods of economic downturn. Inspiration and creativity gained during hard times is renowned to be greater. Think of the music industry. Often the most inspiring periods in fine art, music, performing arts have occurred at a period where the economy is at its lowest. Reconciling the apex of innovation and creativity with the trough of the economic cycle is a challenging and interesting aspect worthy of pursuit. Evidence that the effect of the arts on the economy is at its greatest during such times would provide a formidable case for improved funding to the arts during periods of classical austerity. Governments are similarly realising the potential that spending through the arts is having on the overall economy. French writer André Malraux sums this up nicely. And governments are tapping into the creative industries as one of the fastest growing areas of the economy. Demand for arts and culture, the form of entertainment, increasing fragmented leisure time is valued at a premium. Yet it's still underfunded, and the knock-on effects are not incorporated to the full. With the work here at Maastricht University and with Mach, we've been involved in policy making for the local municipality to focus on those wider issues surrounding the arts and creative entrepreneurship. A point of contention, as an example. Is it fair and just that house improvements are charged at 6% value-added tax, yet restoration of artworks are charged the full 21%, as if they were consumption goods? Amending this would be an important policy move to support the arts. I look forward to having this opportunity to help make a change. Maastricht has been extremely good to me, and I hope I can also give back to the city and be good for Maastricht. Finally, I'd like to talk about the differing cultures of these two disciplines, art and finance. My intention of this inaugural address is to enlighten us in finance to the broader metrics beyond analysing financial risk and return. The customs and belief in behavioural finance have led the field in establishing that cognition and perceptions are important in understanding how reality and individuals make decisions. Taking this a step further to understand how sentiment, issues of trust, and how evocative emotions are all take centre stage in influencing the uncertainty surrounding decisions. And this helps reconcile classic finance theory with how financial decisions are made in reality. Taking this even further, such that a more integrated, holistic approach to financial decision-making would incentivize us as a society to focus on the aspects of our society and culture that have crucially cost us in order to reap economic growth, would help us to tackle many of the societal issues that currently face us. This current practice of outsourcing the inputs of production to the most profitable source is a false economy, short-term gain at long-term cost to society. To make financial decisions that also take into consideration these costs to society and the environment, without having to rely on the mechanism of the government to redistribute, which is often unable to do, it's vital to educate about the value chain. Cultural finance needs to change to reflect the values beyond this sole metric of profits. Rather than squeeze the system so tightly for every ounce of financial gain, thought and consideration of how companies make their returns will put greater value and pressure on externalities in this process. We've all witnessed and experienced the effect of the global financial crisis, which has been the longest and the period of recession in history. And this crisis is a legacy of the process of externalizing social and cultural values when making financial decisions. Greed from actors in the system, bankers, brokers, public employees, consumers, incentivized by a system of focusing on individual rent-seeking at the cost of society, exacerbated the crisis. But this greater risk is borne for society at large and needs to be taken into account when making decisions. Magnified by the uncertainty of how our changing climate, ecosystem is affecting agricultural production, energy reserves, record droughts, catastrophic weather, etc., these risks are only likely to increase in the future. After the crisis, there was much debate about the drastic need for cultural change. However, the discipline has reverted back to the same mechanism of traditional financial decision-making. But financial decision-making should be made with a conscience. The fiduciary duty of institutional investors and corporations could be made more conscious rather than just rational. The importance of societal issues as community trust can be effectively transmitted through the arts and the power of images. The arts provides us with this creative means to provide awareness to educate about these consequences and externalities that have been created in this disconnected economic system. And we can empower people and businesses through incentives to value our natural environment, society, and cultural capital. We can take a more integrated, enlightened, and holistic approach to financial decision-making. The culture of finance can learn from the culture of the arts to do this. Their impact will then be more highly valued in line with the true impact on society. Money will flow to those resources if they're priced within our system, and currently, it doesn't. This year, I took my students in the art markets class to the Royal Academy for a lecture in the Life Room. They were lucky to sit on the benches where Turner and Constable also once sat. And as an academic institution, we can partner with institutions such as the Royal Academy, such as the Van Gogh Museum, the Sotheby's Institute of Art, and TIFAF here in Maastricht, and provide a platform which we can help educate not just arts, but experts about finance, but also financial professionals about the arts. This can also begin with undergraduate level, not just at the postgraduate and executive level. Culture could be more of a fundamental part of the ethics and sustainability efforts that part of the educational programs. Changing the culture of finance can be obtained through higher exposure to arts and culture. Imagine an MBA program with a focus on culture and arts as well as business. Reinforcing these collaborations and providing education is an important part of my work. I end my talk with two focused research challenges. First, there's currently much interest in being able to value social and cultural impact along with economic impact. For example, urban parks provide more tangible qualities, such as to the value of society, from converting carbon monoxide, storm control, dampening noise, and pollution in cities, because they have a knock-on direct effect on public health. Then we can estimate how much can be saved in the provision of healthcare. And that justifies the preservation, for example, of city parks and green spaces. This is without even considering the value of real estate from residing in the vicinity of an urban park. Such methods can be translated to the arts and the well-being of individuals, providing the correct incentives to lenders and investors in the arts to facilitate this process. And it requires educating investors and consumers about this value chain. Secondly, providing those incentives through subsidies, incentives returns in the form of sustainable, quality, and long-term payoffs require key performance indicators related to the returns of other characteristics other than just financial. Incentives that encourage a long-term strategy will foster more trust and collective behaviour. Establishing long-term metrics is an imperative part of this process. I hope to have convinced you that finance can learn from the arts, and moreover, that the arts will benefit from more finance. At the end of this talk, I'd just like to thank you for your attention and allow me to take a few moments of your time to thank those people who've supported me over the years. Like many other people here today, I owe a huge debt to some visionary scholars, many present here today, and I'm enormously grateful for your inspiration and confidence in me, as well as, of course, to those who have made my appointment here as Professor in Art Finance possible. Distinguished Board, Executive, President and Deans of Maastricht University, and distinguished colleagues here. I'd like to extend this thanks to the Maastricht Centre of Arts and Culture, Conservation and Heritage for their initiatives in bringing together this close cooperation across 3 faculties, the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, School of Business and Economics, and the Faculty of Law, and allow me to join them in sharing in this ambitious vision to educate and contribute to policy in the arts, and also for organising this annual conference, which has been part of this ceremony today. So thank you, Vivian van Zaza, and to all the other members of the steering committee. I look forward to strengthening our working ties across the various initiatives, also with Pip, Professor Laurenson, at the Tate, and with TFAF, who is currently in Maastricht as well, with Sotheby's Institute of Art for inviting me to teach for the years on their art business programme to the Royal Academy of Arts as well. I look forward to further collaboration. I'd like to extend this thanks to our current Dean, Professor Vergouwen, dear Philip, and to our Head of Department, Professor Bos, dear Jaap, without the support of both the faculty, together with the Finance Department, who've supported this position. If I look back at my time at the Finance Department, then I've had the utmost pleasure and good fortune to work in this innovative department that has allowed me a constructive balance between autonomy and freedom, and guidance and support. Dear Professor Eichholz, dear Pete, thank you for your support at the beginning of my academic career, who hired me and encouraged me to blossom my career here. You taught me to shoot for the stars, going back to the first slide. And I appreciate all you've done for me here. The generosity, support and kindness throughout the university is something I cherish. And dear Professor Bauer, dear Bob, in the early days, Rob, in the early days, we shared an office. I used to call him Bob. Always happy to lend an ear at times when sometimes I was juggling more balls than I could probably manage, but I'm glad I persevered. Thanks to Peter for awakening my interest in finance following a degree in economics and econometrics, and Dennis, who suggested that I actually do a PhD and put me in touch with a potential supervisor, Case. Dear Professor Kudijk, dear Case, who also had the faith very early in my career and oftentimes brought me back to earth and made me focus on the present, what's possible within the academic industry. I appreciate your direct openness and confidence in me, and also for extending your network and allowing me to blossom. Not always the easiest of paths, thank you. Also, to all my co-authors and PhD, in general, I will have fulfilled my job if I'm able to pass on the passion and interest for research to others as others have passed on to me. Also to my mother, my recently deceased father, who initiated my interest not just in the stars, but in scholarship and academia. They taught me the values of critical thinking, integrity, and independent thought, and moreover, opened my eyes to the world. I'm supported here today by my dearest cousin Mike, representative of many in the family, who are unable to be here today. Thank you. My deepest, utmost thanks goes to my family, my darling husband and my beautiful daughters, without whose continued support and love, I would not have had the time and space to dedicate myself to my work. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for the times that it sadly took precedence. My deepest respect and thanks to you all. Ik heb gezegd.
Dear Professor Pownall, dear Professor Laurenson, let me also congratulate you on behalf of the academic community, and in particular also congratulate the two faculties, the School of Business and Economics and the Faculty of Arts, Social Sciences. I think that much was said about the initiatives on arts and sciences, and I just wanted to remind you that next to the 3 faculties who are present here in MAC, we also have, of course, 3 other faculties on the other side of the river in general, but that also there arts meet science. And I make strong case precisely to try to move much more in the interaction between arts and sciences. And my strong line is that we need in every laboratory, we need basically to have artists in residence in every laboratory. That's one of the claims I will go for. So there is a conference actually tomorrow, which is mirrored to MAC, which are the 3 other faculties, so to say, and which deals very much with sonification of dance, which will be from the neurosciences, the music in the brain, which is also from the Faculty of Psychology and Neurosciences, and imaging, which is coming from the Faculty of Health and Life Sciences, and which is in the theater on the Vrijthof. So I just use this to enlarge further from the 3 inner city faculties to some of the other faculties. Ladies and gentlemen, we have 2 new professors. You might have seen that there is a gender movement in the right direction in our university, and I'm delighted that, of course, we have, and I will give you the chance now to congratulate our 2 new professors at the reception, to which I invite you all now. I close this session.